Obviously, this is the In Their 20s podcast. We're going to be discussing your 20s. I want to back it up a little earlier, though, than your 20s. I had a chance to watch a TED Talk that you gave a few years ago. And in it, you left a very interesting quote on the screen for a little bit. None of my high school friends would have predicted it. And I assume it being the success. So I'm curious, who was Mark Suster in high school? What were you interested in? And why would none of your high school friends predict the success that we see today?
Well, thank you for asking that. I tell you, the picture that I put up when I did this talk was of me buying my first alcohol.
Yes.
And, I was actually, it was legal. So I was 18 years old. And back then in Hawaii, you could buy alcohol when you were 18. So I was like so happy to buy my first legal alcohol. I said they wouldn't have predicted it because I was like every kind of social kid at the time. I was at all the parties and liked to have a good time. And they probably saw me as the happy-go-lucky guy who threw keg parties and stuff like that. That was me. And when I look at the attributes of what I built in my teens, I could now look forward to a path of what predicted success. And here's just a couple of takeaways from my teens. I don't know why, but I started a business in high school. I just had an idea, and the idea was to create a t-shirt company. And the idea was I played basketball, and I was okay. I was pretty good at basketball, but they shut down a local high school near us. And all of a sudden, having closed and combined two high schools into one, I was no longer good enough to play on the team. And so my basketball career was over. And I'm like, well, what do I do with this? And I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to be in the cheering section, but I want the cheering section to be the best cheering section it can be. And so I printed t-shirts. So we called the cheering section the River Rats. It was Sacramento, California, the Rio Americano River Rats. And I thought, well, we need t-shirts. If we're going to have spirit, we all should look the same and come out, and the opposing team should see us. And so I built t-shirts. I designed a rat on the front. It was pretty cool. And it had a lot of hidden messages in it, like honestly, alcohol related messages, as you do when you're in your teens and you're a rebel like I was. And down the sleeve, it said D some B's, which we told the administration meant dunk some basketballs, but it really meant drink some beers. But I had to build a product that people didn't want their parents to know about, right? That's what you do when you're in your teens. But here's the thing. So I sold them for $18 a shirt. But then I had them embossed on the back. You could get letters of like your cool name or whatever. And so for me, it was Dr. Seuss. All the profit margin was in the letters. But of course, when you saw people wearing their River Rat shirt to school and it had their name on it and it was their cool name and what they wanted to go by, like suddenly they started selling like hotcakes. And I made my first few $100s as an entrepreneur doing that. And recently, a friend from high school found one in his closet, sent me a picture, and there's actually a picture. I put it on Twitter, and it's actually the first business I ever did on my own. And the second business was mobile keg business, but I don't recommend that to anybody.
We're gonna have to find that photo on your Twitter and link it to the podcast. That sounds super interesting. Entrepreneur at heart, but obviously before we get to the time when you founded a company, later in life, I want to talk about Accenture. But before we even get to Accenture, I want to talk about your time in Chicago. You went to the University of Chicago, got your MBA. Really cool to see that because I am calling you from Chicago right now. I've been here for the past 5 years. That's a big thing that people in their 20s are considering sometimes, whether or not to get the MBA. We hear that MBAs are great opportunities to build your network, to really further your skills. But Mark, what did you personally get from getting an MBA?
So I say there's 4 things. Oh, I said 4 and I hold up 5 fingers. I can't count. There are 4 things that matter for an MBA. So 3 plus 1. Okay. There's 3 on the positive, 3 on the negative. The first is curriculum. The second is certificate. The third is your colleagues. So the 3 C's, and you have to weigh that against cost. Okay. So for the most part, the certificate is the most marketable thing that you get out of it. The coursework that you take or the curriculum only matters, in my opinion, if you didn't study business. If your undergraduate degree is business, it's going to mostly be a repeat. The people who got the most out of the curriculum were people like architects or people who studied philosophy. They didn't have a grounding in economics. I studied economics undergrad, so most of my MBA was a repeat. So I tell people, if you're going to get an MBA, you should over-index on the colleagues, because that's the great unlock. The great unlock is the network you're going to build. It's the smart people. It's the people who are going to hustle, who are going to get jobs, who you're going to do business development with, or you're going to join forces, start companies, the connective tissue that you create. Now, you have to weigh that against your cost, because it's very expensive and it takes you out of your job career, your job path for 2 years. So there's a lot of research published, but really there's probably only 8 or 10 places in the country that economically are worth the cost. University of Chicago was #1. So it's a combination of, it's a great academic institution for an MBA, but also the majority of people who go there come from the Midwest, where they have lower salaries on average than other places. And then they springboarded their careers into finance in New York and LA and other places where they increased their comp.
That's awesome. So is this then like a mental model that you came up with when you were in your 20s, when you were looking for grad school, or is this something that you have, come to graduate grad school and you really were able to think about it all? And now you want to share that with people who are currently in their 20s.
I had no plan for life whatsoever. I bumbled my way through every decision I ever made just from my gut and instinct and networking and asking people. Look, I have to be honest, there was no internet in my 20s. I couldn't read. There's no podcast. There's no one, it was books. You could read books. And I don't know why. I just was interested in reading other people's advice. So I'll tell you one I read. I don't know if it's still valuable, but I'll tell you the one I know for sure is valuable is How to Win Friends and Influence People. And I know today the title's so cheesy, but there's so many truisms that come from How to Win Friends and Influence People. It was the author's Dale Carnegie. And there's a lot of life lessons that I think young people could learn from in that book. If you open yourself to reading a book with that title, you probably want a book cover so people don't see you reading it. It's a little bit try hard, I think. The second book I read early in my 20s was called How to Swim with the Sharks Without Being Eaten Alive, a guy named Harvey Mackay. And it's all parables and life lessons that he learned. And I'll give you one example, which is, he said, the key to my success, my formula to success, this is Harvey Mackay speaking, is everybody starts things. Everybody starts things. I finish. So he talked about how he learned Japanese. And he's like, everyone says they want to learn something new, and everyone gets started with vigor and does it for 30 days and peters out. I'm not smarter. I'm not more ambitious. I'm not more talented. I just have persistence. I finish. And that has always stuck with me about anything in life, which is, if you are persistent and you stick with things and you don't change things. So my example from childhood is, my parents wanted me to play music, right? So I played piano for a couple of years. Then I got bored and played trumpet for a couple of years. Then I got bored and played saxophone for a couple of years. And, by the time I'm off in college, I didn't know shit. And I said, to my wife, when we had kids, I have 2 teenage boys. I said, they can choose anything they want to play, but when they make a selection, they're going to stick with it. And we're going to develop a skill, whatever they choose, and not let them do 5 different things. So that my older son stuck with guitar for 10 years. My younger son stuck with keyboard for 10 years. My younger son, after 10 years, kind of grew out of it and said, now I want to play drums. And he took up drums and he's doing amazing at drums, but had a foundation. He stuck with things. So anyway, those are 2 books that I read and got interested. But other than that, I didn't really have a life plan. I just kind of went along and learned lessons as I went. So now I try to give back.
I love the lesson on finding something and sticking with it also. I mean, I just feel like there are so many distractions in the world. A lot of times we don't see, success with these side things or hobbies early, so we end up quitting them. But you really have to stick with them. I understand another lesson you did give your boys as well is something that you learned from your mom at a young age is, if you don't ask, you don't get. So I'm curious, relating that to your experience at Accenture, if we can then pivot into that. What are some times when you use that principle during that career in your life?
Yeah, so I will tell you, I just was raised this way, maybe Jewish mom. She had a bit of chutzpah. She always was pushing the boundaries in a way, like I was like always covering my face because she would always ask for things. And I thought, God, why does she always have to ask for extra? But then I just realized that it was passed down to me as well. So the
Mhm.
story I want to give you is from my son, and how these things get passed through modeling, which is my son, when he was like in second grade, my wife would take him to a bakery, and she would have him do his homework. And at the end of doing his homework, he could get a treat. So one day he does that, and he asked my wife, "Can I have a slice of chocolate cake?" And she says, "No, honey, you can't have the chocolate cake. You can pick any other cake, but the chocolate cake isn't cut yet." And and he says, "Well, but why can't I have that?" She said, "Well, like some cakes are whole and they're sold whole, and some are cut already, and you can have the stuff that's cut already." And he said, "Well, how do you know?" And she said, "Well," and my wife is not like me. She does not like to push boundaries.
Mhm.
And so she said, "Okay, well, if you'd like to ask, we can ask." So my son, Jacob, who was, second grade, asked the lady, "Could I have a piece of chocolate cake?" And her answer, "Sure." She took it and she cut it and handed it off. And my wife's just like amazed at it. And she's like, "Thank God you take after your dad." So like that is just like a parable for me, for anyone thinking about, you have to do it politely.
Mhm.
You can politely ask for things that are respectful. Um, and you have to have logic and persuasion and be polite about it and accept no, and then come back the next day and find a different way to ask.
So a time when you did use that principle at Accenture, led to you being able to, travel and work
Yeah.
abroad.
Hmm. Hmm.
I'm curious, is that something you'd recommend? As I know this was perfect within your own journey, but do you recommend maybe even 20 somethings who currently or work at Upfront? I mean, do you recommend 20 somethings to get that out of country experience, get themselves involved in different cultures, and just how impactful was that time to you?
Yeah. So I want to tell a quick side story, Landon, and then I
Of course,
promise
of
I'll
course. No,
answer
I'm
your
loving these
question,
side
which is
stories, by the way.
so. I apologize. I
No, I
can
love
get
these. I love
sidetracked.
these.
So listen. The world acts on a pull model, not a push model, and that's something I didn't know that I learned.
Huh.
And so what I mean is this: let's say you work for somebody, and you go to that somebody and say, "Oh, I'd like to work in a different group. Can you champion me working somewhere else?" And the answer is always going to be no. Because if you're working in a direct line, those people want you. They want that skill set. They want you for your team. So, like, for whatever reason, people tend not to go out of their way to push you into new opportunities. It's not that
Hmm.
they're bad or trying to stymie your career, but with self interest, they're always thinking, well, let me just persuade Mark that he needs to stay on my team. So I was working on a team in Los Angeles, and my boss, very nice guy, and I kind of wanted to travel and go see the world. And I sold him on this idea of, hey, maybe you could help me. And he didn't help. And it was very frustrating. So I said, okay, I have to solve this myself. So I started networking with people who actually lived abroad, and I actually traveled abroad in order to meet more people who worked abroad. I don't know why I was just obsessed with working in Europe. So I went over there, I started networking, I started finding out all the Americans who were working abroad. And then I found one who wanted me and was willing to champion me.
Wow.
And then now I had someone who was willing to pull me in. And so now I went to my boss in LA and I said, look, there's this group that really wants me to transfer to France. And I'd really like to go, and they want me to come. So that's the pull model, finding someone who wants you. And of course, my boss wanted to say no. So I said, look, if you really don't want me to do this, I'll be forced to leave and I'll just go work for another company. I don't want to do that. I want to stay in our company. And I had to like play my cards a little bit because he wasn't going to give up easily. But it never would have worked if I didn't have a pull. And everything I've ever done in my life that has been successful, it's like finding someone who wants what you have to offer and letting them pull you in, rather than asking your current organization to push you to new opportunities. So yes, I think people should work internationally. Everybody in the US who's never lived or worked abroad thinks that, we are told that that we're exceptional. I love America. I'm proudly American, but like there's a world out there. And,
Yeah.
I will tell you, in Japan, the trains are much better than the United States. The food is much better than the United States. cleaner, they're politer, they have better telecommunication. They have, it's runs light years around the United States. You go to France, the TGV, you can get transport between cities at high speeds. We don't have that in the US. That Paris, such a clean city, the metro is so clean. We don't have that in the US. We have a lot of things in the US other people don't have, but when you get out and see the world, you realize that there are great things everywhere. And you start to realize the different cultures and how people make decisions. I'll give you one example, which is the United States is very transactional. It's like,
Hmm.
you meet someone, okay, let's get down to business. I want to know things. But Italians don't work that way. Italians want a relationship with you and they want to know who you are and they don't want to talk about a transaction. If they trust you, if you build rapport, then you can do anything. But they first want to know who you are. Do you just want me for the transaction? Is this, you don't really care about me? But if you care about me, then, then maybe I'll unlock more for you. So like they really want to go to meals. They want to go have coffee. They don't want to talk about work. They want to see what makes you tick. And when you start to realize that cultures make decisions in different ways, then you won't just like be so linear in your thinking. There is another quote, just because I'm jumping around a lot today,
Of
but it came
course.
from another person I used to follow in my 20s named Zig Ziglar. Um, People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Mm.
And Zig Ziglar was the master of sales. And like so many people when they're young think sales is a bad thing. I mean, sales is a great thing because if you believe in the product that you're selling, if you believe you're really going to help people with your product, your service, or frankly with you, you're actually helping them. I always say to people who are fundraising, if you're fundraising, the job of an investor is to invest. So you're selling something, what you're selling is a piece of your business, right? So you're selling equity and they're a buyer of equity. And if you think you're going to be incredibly valuable and make money, you're doing them a favor by letting them invest. So selling, it's not a dirty thing. And so like the main thing is, if you are transactional and you want to sell and move on and you don't care if you burn people, you can make quick fortune, but you're not going to build a long-term career where people trust you. If you respect the person who's buying and you're solving their problem and you're selling something that you think is valuable to them and you build a relationship, you'll have clients who buy from you for 30 years. So anyway, I just say like, you discovering the world will enrich the person that you are and make you realize that people do business in different ways.
I love that, Mark. You shared so much good advice there. I just kind of want to break down a few things. First off, my listeners are probably going to get tired that I say this all the time, but value is really a two-way street. Before I go into any situation, because you're right. I mean, the business world is very transactional. You got to first do your best to just figure out what you can do that for that person first and create a solid relationship. I think that's so powerful. Also, I love your push versus pull model as well. I mean, it's something I've never heard before, but I mean, it's really true if you really think about it. Like if you're performing well here, it's going to be very difficult to get opportunities to go out because, why would your team want to get rid of you? But if you have like an actual reason, if you're able to create these connections yourself, if you're able to do the work, I mean, that can really help move you around and, get access to new opportunities. But it takes you. I mean, no one's going to hold your hand. It takes you to really do that yourself. So another moment I want to talk about in your life was the time when you created a startup. And you spoke about this in your TED Talk as well, as betting on yourself. You had this career at Accenture. You were there for 8+ years, and you ended up quitting 9 months before making associate partner to bet on yourself, take a huge risk in life, and create a startup, which, it's your story, not mine. We'll get to talk about it, but it was a very successful move. I'm curious, though, during this area of your life, what did you learn? And just how scary was that move to take a risk and start your own company?
When I talk to potential entrepreneurs, what I say is, of all the people who follow startups, there will be 99 of them who always talk about doing it and never do. And I call them entrepreneurs. And entrepreneurs are people who theoretically want to do it, but aren't willing to do the single hardest bit, which is weird. It's the hardest bit is just to say I'm doing it and to start.
Yeah.
And I think because people fear that, and in a way it's fearing shame, it's fearing failure, it's fearing having to tell people that whatever I did didn't work out. I mean, I just talked to a very successful person today whose company I backed, and they just decided to shut it down today. And I feel terrible for them. And I just said, look, I feel really sorry for you. I know today's going to be a difficult day. I'm wishing you courage as you go through the next several weeks, because, you know, who cares if someone failed? But I know that there's a lot of shame associated with it, which is why people don't like to start, because people don't like to fail. But if you're not willing to accept failure and accept that you might fail, you'll never try anything, right? So what do we do is, instead of saying, I'm going to start a business, what we do is we put our right arm around somebody we barely know and our left arm around someone that we barely know. And we all jump off the cliff together, and we call ourselves co-founders. Because now it's not my failure, it's collective failure. And it's not me being brave, we're all being brave. And I think that's the worst thing you can do. So here you're about to start a journey with something that's going to be difficult, that probably isn't going to work. And if it does work, you're probably not going to make everything you expected. And what are you doing? You've already taken 2/3 dilution and you haven't raised a penny. You've already attached yourself to people that may be more complicated over the years that you work with them than you realize today in the 6 months that you've known them when you got excited about this idea. They may have more risk tolerance or less risk tolerance. They have more drive and ambition or less drive and ambition. They may go through years of getting into alcohol abuse, or getting into, like, maybe they get married and get distracted. Whatever. Like, there's a million things that happen along the journey. So I just wouldn't rush into any of that. If you really want to try being an entrepreneur, and by the way, it's not for everyone. It's a really tough lifestyle, and often it doesn't pay off. So I'm not like glamorizing it. But if in your bones you think you want to try, the younger you try, the better. The more times you can fail in your 20s, the cost of failing in your 20s is much easier than failing in your 40s, because you tend to have less encumbrances. And frankly, if you try a couple of times, actually, especially in the United States, it's a badge to have done it, and to be able to say to people, yeah, I know what startup's like, because I started 2 of my own companies. They weren't wildly successful, but I learned a lot from them. And now I'm ready to go and join your team and do whatever. But in any event, like, I just encourage people, if you want to try, but do the one thing that no one ever does, is make the leap. And what I tell people usually is to hire your co-founders. And I know that sounds bizarre, but if I register a company, come up with a concept, write a business plan or like a deck that describes what I'm going to do, I've already captured probably 70% of the value, because just those actions of having an idea. Now I approach the 99 entrepreneurs. They really want to do it. They just don't want to take the leap. And I say, you know what? I'm looking for a co-founder, someone to join my company. And I've got 20% allocated to my co-founder to join. I only want the right person. So I'm interviewing people to be the co-founder. Like, who gets a call and says, I want to give away 20% of my company if you'll join me? What people do instead is they don't want to do the limited amount, a few months of hard work of picking a problem and fleshing it out and registering a company. So instead, when you go to people and you're like, I don't really know what we should do, but let's brainstorm ideas. Now I have to give up 50% of my company. And the problem with that is not just the pure economics of it, but what you're doing is you're making decision-making that much harder. Because if you hire someone and you give them 20% of your company, and after 2 years, you realize it wasn't the right person, you still are in control. You can make changes. So I actually believe, unless you really know the people well, and unless you really have jived with them on different businesses in the past, and it's someone you deeply trust, I'd just be careful. I like co-founders. I mostly fund co-founders. I'm not anti-co-founders. But there's something to be said about betting on yourself.
First off, great advice to current founders, especially founders in their 20s. So I love that. Second of all, I mean, you're really sharing a lot of great points today. I mean, but just a point on failure, the ones that end up fearing failure are ultimately the ones that do fail. I think a lot of times people don't realize that, because obviously it's very scary to just start. It doesn't have to be as large as a scale as starting a company. I mean, I think this is relevant advice to anybody trying to start a hobby, trying to start a podcast, trying to start a newsletter. Doesn't matter what it is. If you don't just make that leap because you think it's going to fail, no, I mean, I think you can learn from failure, but you shouldn't go into situations, of course, thinking that it's just going to fail. No, you should have the confidence, the skills necessary to just get started and see what happens. So I think that's so powerful. So Mark, this has been such a great interview. Final question for you is going to be a fun one. Obviously, you are the managing partner at Upfront Ventures. You guys run LA, and I've just created such a large impact. I mean, not just obviously in California, but the world. Many companies within your portfolio are companies that people in their 20s really do enjoy: Bird, Goat, etc. So I'm curious, that was great advice that you gave for co-founders in their 20s. Would love to just ask, what other advice do you give to current founders, within your own portfolio? Maybe, young founders, first-time founders trying to build something big. If they come to you and Upfront, what advice are you giving them?
Well, the advice will always be situational. So I don't like, if a founder is coming and pitching me, I'm listening and trying to understand what problem they're trying to solve. But I'd say the biggest unlock for most people would come in this idea that I tell people, and I'm going to tie two concepts together. And I think it'll apply whether people are trying to start their own company or not, because this is valuable for everybody. Number one, I call 50 coffee meetings. 50 coffee meetings is a metaphor for taking one meeting per week with someone you don't know.
Wow.
Reaching out to somebody you don't know and taking a meeting. So I started this idea of 50 coffee meetings to say, if you contacted someone and said, could I have 30 minutes of your time? I'm going to bring coffee to you. I have an objective. My objective of the meeting is X. Like, so too many people contact someone and like, hey, can we meet? And they don't really say why you're meeting. And the recipient is like trying to figure out, God, is this a waste of my time or not? But if you say it's 30 minutes, I'm trying to develop a career in marketing. I know that you work in PR, or I know that you work in product management, or I know that you work in out of home marketing, or whatever component you're trying to discover more about. And you said to them, I'm not coming to you for a job. I want to learn more about your day-to-day job so that I can build a knowledge repository to help me decide which parts of my career I want to develop in the future. So you said it yourself about this two-way exchange of value. My shorthand for that is you got to give before you get. So I'm not here to ask for anything. I would love to have your knowledge, and I'm not going to ask you for anything, but I'm just going to take notes and reflect and build for myself a playbook for life. I'd be super grateful. Everyone wants to give back. Everyone wants to help young people. They just don't have enough time. So if you say it's 30 minutes and I'm bringing you coffee, okay, I'm in. Now you take the meeting, you have it, you digest the knowledge, you ask good questions, you be thoughtful. If you do one of those per week, every single week of the year, first of all, it gets easier. You feel less like you're putting yourself out. Don't always go senior people, see people who are 5 years ahead of you, not 50 years ahead of you. I mean, it's okay to ask senior people too, but build lots of networks. But then after a year, you're not going to keep up with 50 of those people, but you probably will keep up with 7. So if you could build 7 meaningful relationships and 43 other people that now you can remind them that you met in the past and you can ping them for various things in the future, you're really building your network. And I think it's incredibly important. And the second point I want to tie into that, and this is something I still use in my life, which I call triangulation. How do you problem solve? How do you make hard decisions? Well, any decision I have to make that I'm weighing in my mind, I try to call 5 or 6 people and I ask what they would do. And triangulation comes from sailing, where you take 2 different points or 3 different points in the distance to try and true your direction. Okay, that's the metaphor I'd like to leave you with. So if I ask 5 or 6 people, and I'm like, what do you think? What would you do? What do you think about the situation? Have you ever tried this, right? And you listen. From that, not everyone's going to be right. And maybe there is no universal truth, but you start to hear a common theme and you decide in your gut which of those sounds the best direction for you. So seeing those data points helps point you in the right direction. And if you can tie 50 coffee meetings, which is meeting all sorts of new people, building networks, with triangulation, that can help you with your career advice. It can help you with a problem you're trying to solve. It can help you try to figure out how to finance something. Whatever your solution is, those 2 ideas are probably the most powerful I've had in my life.
Mark, I love that. Thank you so much. I just want to say, overall, you did not have to do this. I mean, you did not have to share everything that's going on in here, or even spend time with me, today, and even go over. This has been such a delightful time. I know my audience obviously is going to learn so much from this, but me personally, like I'm gonna have to rewatch this a million times and just retake notes, because you shared a
Thank you.
lot of amazing advice. And I just
Thank
want to
you,
say
Landon.
thank you so
I
much.
will tell you, I'm open on Twitter. As you know, if people tweet at me, I'm at msuster, MSUSTER. And I try my best to be responsive to comments. If people like ask fair questions, I try to be responsive on Twitter.
Perfect. I'll make sure to link that in the podcast.
Okay.
But again, Mark, I hope you have a wonderful week. Thank you. Thank you.
Of course, Landon, it's a pleasure. Like, I really enjoyed when we talked before. So that was like an easy ask then following up from that.
Perfect. Well, enjoy the
All right,
rest of your
man.
week, and I'll make sure to
Thank
stay in
you.
touch. See you,
Stay in
Mark.
touch, please. Take care.
Bye-bye.